June Moore, an 18-year-old girl with big dreams, was the pride of her strict parents, Mr. and Mrs. Moore. Known for her academic talent, June was on a path to greatness. She planned to study business management at a prestigious university and eventually take over her father's successful business. This was not just her dream, but the plan her parents had made for her. They constantly reminded her to focus on her studies and avoid distractions that could harm her future. The Moores envisioned their daughter continuing the family legacy and becoming a powerful businesswoman. But June had a secret that threatened everything. She had recently discovered she was pregnant. The news shook her, filling her with fear and guilt. Every night as she lay in bed, her thoughts raced. How would she tell her parents? What would happen to her dreams? The future that once seemed clear now felt uncertain. Her parents had no idea what was happening. Every dinner, they proudly discussed her bright future, unaware of the storm inside their daughter. The pressure became unbearable, and June knew she couldn't keep her secret any longer. The fear of facing their disappointment was paralyzing. One evening, after another tense dinner where her parents shared their hopes for her, June reached her breaking point. "I can't stay here anymore," she muttered, her hands trembling. That night, when the house was quiet, June packed a small bag, just a few clothes, some money she had saved, and a photo of her family. She paused at the door, taking one last look at her room, the place where she had spent countless hours studying and dreaming. But now it reminded her of what she was losing. In the dead of night, June slipped out of the house, her heart pounding as she moved through the dark streets. She made her way to the bus station, determined to get as far away as possible. As she boarded the bus, she took a seat by the window, her mind racing. "What will they think when they find me gone?" she thought, tears in her eyes. The bus ride was long, and June watched the city lights blur by, feeling more uncertain with each mile. When the bus finally stopped in a small, unfamiliar town, she stepped off, clutching her bag tightly. It was late and the streets were eerily quiet. As she wandered, cold and alone, June spotted a small diner with a warm glow from the windows. The sign read Anne's Diner. Desperate for shelter, she decided to go inside. The diner was cozy, filled with the smell of coffee and baked goods. June felt a small sense of relief as she stepped inside, but her heart was still heavy with fear. She didn't know what to do next, but for now, she just needed a place to sit and think. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Anne, the diner's owner. She was a kind woman with a gentle smile, and she noticed June's troubled expression. "Hello there, dear," Mrs. Anne said warmly, approaching June. "You look like you could use a break. Why don't you sit down?" June nodded, too overwhelmed to speak, and took a seat at a small table near the window. Mrs. Anne brought her a cup of hot chocolate and sat down across from her. "What's the matter, dear?" Mrs. Anne asked gently. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders." June's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Mrs. Anne. For the first time, she felt she could let go of her burden. I'm pregnant," she confessed, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do. My parents, they'll be so disappointed in me. I couldn't stay." Mrs. Anne listened with compassion. "Oh, June," she said softly, reaching out to hold her hand. "That's a lot to carry alone. But you don't have to go through this alone. Your parents must be worried sick about you. Let's call them and let them know you're safe." June's heart sank at the thought of calling her parents. She had run away to avoid their disappointment, and the idea of hearing their anger was terrifying. But deep down, she knew Mrs. Ann was right. Her parents deserved to know where she was. Back at home, Mr. and Mrs. Moore were in a panic. They had discovered June's empty room. They had called everyone they could think of, but no one had seen her. "Where could she have gone?" Mrs. Moore cried, pacing the living room. "What could have driven her to leave like this?" When the phone rang, Mrs. Moore grabbed it, her voice shaky. Mrs. Ann introduced herself and explained why June had run away. There was a long pause on the other end. Mrs. Moore's voice was cold when she finally spoke. "You can keep June," she said bitterly before hanging up. Mrs. Ann was left stunned, the receiver still in her hand. She couldn't understand how a mother could abandon her daughter so easily, especially in such a vulnerable situation. She knew she had to give the Moores time to process everything and hope they would come around. During the week that followed, June and Mrs. Ann grew closer. June helped out at the diner, finding comfort in the routine. Mrs. Ann could see that June was a bright, hard-working girl, full of potential despite the challenges she faced. One day, Mrs. Ann tried calling the Moores again, hoping they had reconsidered. But Mrs. Moore's response was just as harsh. "I was serious," she said coldly. "We don't want her back. Don't contact us again." Mrs. Ann was heartbroken. She couldn't understand how two people who had once been so proud of their daughter could turn their backs on her now. But June had nowhere else to go, and she begged Mrs. Ann to let her stay. "I'm almost done with school," June pleaded. "I'll work here at the diner for free, and I'll finish my studies at an adult school. I want to make something of myself, even though I'm pregnant. Please give me a chance." Mrs. Ann saw the determination in June's eyes and decided to support her. She knew June was a bright girl with a promising future, despite the challenges she faced. June worked hard to finish her studies, attending antenatal classes and helping out at the diner. Her hard work paid off when she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl named April and passed her exams with distinctions. As time went on, June developed a deep love for the diner. She had big ideas for expanding the business, but was nervous about sharing them with Mrs. Ann. One day, she finally mustered the courage. "I think we could turn the diner into a full restaurant," June said hesitantly. "We could attract more customers and grow the business." Mrs. Ann listened carefully, impressed by June's creativity. "I love the idea," she said with a smile, "but I prefer my small diner the way it is. However, I'm willing to invest in your idea, June. How about you open your own restaurant in the city?" June was thrilled. At just 21 years old, she became a restaurant owner and started studying business management. Mrs. Ann took care of little April while June worked hard to build her business. June's restaurant thrived, and she was recognized as a rising star in the business world. She was even featured in a magazine, her story inspiring others to overcome their challenges and follow their dreams. One day, at Mrs. Moore's Ladies' Society meeting, a friend handed her a magazine. "Isn't this your daughter?" she asked, pointing to June's picture on the cover. Mrs. Moore's heart sank as she recognized June's face. She nodded, forcing a smile, but inside she was filled with regret. At home she showed the magazine to her husband. Together they wept, realizing the mistake they had made. They had abandoned their only child, and now she was making a name for herself without them. After a month of soul-searching, the Moores decided to visit June's restaurant. When June saw her parents walk in, she was stunned. Overwhelmed with emotion, she ran into her office, tears streaming down her face. Her parents waited anxiously until June's assistant invited them into her office. As soon as they walked in, all three began to cry. "We're so sorry, June," her mother sobbed. "We were wrong. We let our pride get in the way, and we hurt you. Can you ever forgive us?" June looked at her parents, her heart aching with the pain of their abandonment, but she also saw the genuine regret in their eyes. "I've missed you both so much," she whispered through her tears. "I want us to be a family again." They embraced, the room filled with the sound of their sobs. It was a moment of reconciliation, a chance to heal the wounds of the past. Later that week, the Moores met their granddaughter April and thanked Mrs. Ann for everything she had done for June. They were finally a family again, stronger and closer than ever before. Moral of the story: true success is not measured by avoiding failure or disappointment, but by the courage to face challenges, the strength to pursue your dreams, and the power of love and forgiveness to heal even the deepest wounds. Thank you for watching. God bless you.